Welcome, 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 welcome to It's Getting Better All the Time Mental Health Outreach with your host, Sister A. Legree, providing information and support while encouraging hope and faith. Let me do a little something here. Okay. Again, this is It's Getting Better All the Time Mental Health Outreach with your host, Sister A. Legree, providing information and support while encouraging hope and faith. You can find out more about us by logging on to our website at igbattmho.org. This morning, today, the title of our broadcast is Man Stabs His Parents, Why? We're going to talk about kind of review a case, unfortunate situation that happened in Brooklyn, New York, where we have a man in his 40s who actually stabbed his elderly parents to death. So again, let me just start off, first of all, by saying you can log on to our website at igbattmho.org to find out more about us. You can also go on the website to support some of the things that we're doing, find out more information, and you can also email us at support@igbattmho.org. So let me read this article from the Daily News newspaper, from the New York Daily News, and it's entitled, and I'm just going to go through it. Brooklyn parents whose son is charged in their slaying tried to get him mental health help. Tried to get him help. It goes on to say the elderly couple stabbed to death in their Brooklyn home had been trying to get mental health help for their son now charged with their murders. Okay, their son was 48 years old, was charged with murder and weapon possessions and double killing. Basically, he stabbed his parents to death. According to a neighbor who's close with the family, said the family had noticed that there were some escalations in his symptoms, and they had planned on getting him some help, right? And it looks like the plan was, okay, let's just kind of get through the weekend. We'll, get him help on Monday, after things calm down. But unfortunately, things escalated to the point where he actually stabbed his parents over the weekend. According to some other, this article said that it looks like he has a history, right? He was institutionalized several times. He was often on medications. He was seeing psychiatrists from time to time. It looks like they took him to the hospital, several times before. And I'm just just kind of going through some of this stuff here. According to another report that I saw, he was described as troubled, someone with quote-unquote having issues. His parents were wonderful people. They were, sounds like they would help anybody who needed help in the neighborhood, so they were just wonderful people. So again, when we look, something like this happens, it's easy to go back and say what could have happened, what should have happened, things could have been done differently. But here's the thing, I think it's important to know, when we are impacted, a loved one, with a person with a persistent mental illness that's untreated, that's poorly treated, it's important not to take that for granted, right? We know that individuals who are living with persistent mental illnesses are not necessarily violent. The key, though, is if you have to look at medication use and drug use. Those two things are red flags. So if you live in with someone or you see someone who has a severe and persistent mental illness and you notice that their symptoms are starting to change, the symptoms are starting to increase, that things are not correct or something. I want to get the wording that they use here. So they described the suspect's escalating illness leading up to the slayings. So there were some symptoms that began to escalate that people noticed up until the slayings, right? So again, when you start seeing these escalating symptoms, and it's important for you to know what your loved one's baseline is or your baseline symptoms are, it's always important to pay attention to those types of things. So what is my purpose for this particular broadcast? A couple of things. Number one, to kind of remind everyone that it's important that we get to know what our symptoms are, right? So if you're the individual that's living with a chronic mental illness, persistent mental illness, or if you're the loved one of a person who is dealing with the symptoms of a chronic mental illness, it's important that one of the things you need to know are what are the baseline symptoms. Because see, when you understand what the baseline symptoms are, you can begin to see when things begin to deviate or fall, begin to deviate or escalate from those baseline symptoms, right? The sooner you can get a person help. Like, this is the baseline symptoms. These are the symptoms are starting to escalate until they get into the acute phase. If you can get, here before it gets to the acute phase, that is what we want to do, right? The sooner we can get a person help, the better. Because as a person who is living with a severe and persistent mental illness can tell you, as they begin to deviate further and further from reality, it's harder, right? It can be harder, so you want to try to intervene before we start seeing the symptoms start to escalate. So again, as a general rule, if you are living with someone who has been impacted by severe and persistent mental illness, or you yourself are living with a severe and persistent mental illness, it's important to, number one, have a conversation about baseline symptoms, have a conversation about crisis symptoms. Have this conversation about, okay, these are my symptoms. What should happen when my symptoms start to escalate? So that's number one. Number two, is important that we also, if you're living impacted in some way by a severe and persistent mental illness, that you have the number to a crisis team if you have one in the particular area. If you have a number to the crisis team, if you don't, you may need to call the police if that's the case. But it's important to realize, if you're living with someone, whether that has a severe and persistent mental illness, or you have the severe and persistent mental illness, please know that it's just that. It's a chronic illness, and an illness that must be managed. And just like any illness that must be managed, you might have highs and lows. You might have different fluctuations in the illness depending on what's going on. According to one of the articles that I read, it sounded like the son may have had some problems at work, right? So again, he had a stressor that escalated the symptoms. So again, do not underestimate the fact that a person with severe and persistent mental illness with escalating symptoms, who is not taking their medications and who is using drugs, may not be the person who you think they are, right? Yes, they may be your husband, your wife, your son, your daughter, your child, but once the symptoms start to escalate, right, and they enter into what's called the acute phase, and they're not taking their medications, that loved one may not be the person that you think they are. You may say, they will never do that to me. You don't know what they will do if they're not taking their medications, and when you talk about substance are also involved into the picture. So keep that in mind. I'm not saying that individuals who with a severe and persistent mental illness are violent. That's not the issue. The issue is a person with severe and persistent mental illness who are not taking their medications and who are using other substances are people or somebody that you have to pay attention to, right? You don't want to treat them the same way. You don't want to minimize the symptoms, because the substances itself can cause a person to act out of character, or to act out of touch, to be out of touch with reality. So when you couple that along with an illness, it can be problematic. So that's important to kind of remember. I think we've done a good job in the community, the mental health community, by saying, we're letting people know that there's help for mental health symptoms. Letting people know, we'll say all the time, an individual living with a mental illness is no more violent than anyone else. And we say those things, right? We say things like, individuals living with a severe and persistent mental illness may be more likely to be a victim than they are to victimize someone else. We say those things. But we have to make sure that we add the part B to that. And the part B to that is, individuals who are living with severe and persistent mental illnesses, who are medicated, who are taking their medications, or in treatment, or not using substances, that's one category, versus someone who is not taking their medications, who is not in treatment, and they're taking substances. That's a different category, okay? So we wanted to kind of pay attention to that. So when you look at the story, the parents love their child. It looks like they would have done anything for him. And what I also read, people were saying things like, how could he do that to his parents? They were such good people, all the things that they tried to do for him. And here's the thing to keep in mind. In his medicated state, in his state where he was getting treatment, he would have never done that to his parents. But that was not the case. In this particular case, he was not medicated. His symptoms had escalated to the point where he was, to a certain degree. He was not getting treatment. And then there were some issues, concerns related to maybe some substances. So again, this person was not the person that they knew. This person was not the son that they loved. This was somebody that was totally somebody different. Something was, voices, things were talking to him. We don't know what his diagnosis is. I think someone mentioned, like I said, maybe depression, but they described him as troubled, weird, awkward, somebody having issues. We know he was in and out of the hospital. We know that this was someone, per reports, who was prescribed medications but had stopped taking medications. I also read something, according to one of the local officials, he said this community has a lot of mental health help, but not everyone wants to be helped. And that is true. And it's especially true for a person who is in an acute phase of their illness, meaning that their symptoms are active, and they may not realize that they need help. That's why it's so important for us as advocates or as people on the outside looking in that we don't minimize, that we take things seriously. That in an effort, sometimes people will say, well, I don't want to make the person, I don't want to be offensive, right? I don't want to, if I say something, if I call the police or, I'm not saying that people with a mental illness, all have a problem. No, we're not saying that. What we're saying is that it's important that we make a difference between those who are in acute phase, those who may engage in violence, and those who may not. And again, it's hard to determine, but there are certain red flags. What is the red flag? Individuals with severe and persistent mental illness with escalating symptoms who are not taking their medications and who may or may not be engaging in substances, right? That person is different from a person who is just impacted by a severe and persistent mental illness, a person who's living with a chronic illness, which is just like any other illness, but that's taking their medications, that's if they need medications or if they're in treatment, they're getting help. That person is totally different. So again, when we look at situations like this, and I'm talking about the case in Brooklyn where we have the 48-year-old man who stabbed his elderly parents to death, it's tragic. You can take a look at this situation and you can think of all of the things that should have been done. But at that moment, you never know. You never know. The mother made the decision, the symptoms were escalating as they probably had been escalating before, because he'd been in and out of hospital before, and say, okay, let's wait over the weekend, and then we'll deal with it on Monday, right? What happened? What happened between Friday and Saturday? When she said, okay, we're going to wait until Monday, what happened? We'll never know because the parents are dead. But what we do know that the symptoms escalated to the point where he murdered his parents. He stabbed his parents to death. He did this because he was he was not in his regular state of mind. In his regular state of mind, I'm quite sure that he would not have ever done this to his parents. Because he was unmedicated, not in treatment, right? His symptoms were escalating, and he had begun some reports using some types of substances. That was just not a good match, a good mix. So what am I saying? If you're in that situation with a loved one, it's important for you not to minimize those symptoms. It's important for you to get your loved one help. If you need to call the crisis team, you call the crisis team. You do it now as you're thinking about it. If you're in the area, there's no crisis team, and if you have to call the police, because in many jurisdictions, the police are like the crisis mental health support. So you do that. But if you do have to call the police, as I said before, I think I shared before, anytime you have to call 911, you want to make sure they know it's a psychiatric emergency. When the police show up, You want to meet the police at the door. You want to be calm. You want to explain to them what's going on. You want to explain to them your concerns. Hey, my loved one is not, their symptoms are escalating. Hey, this is what I'm seeing. They're using drugs. They're not taking their medications, which I know puts them in a situation where they could be even more prone to violence. You may have to do that. And I know for some people it's hard to do that because you love your loved one. But I say it like this: if you saw your loved one bleeding to death, you wouldn't think twice about calling 911. So realize that when we have our loved ones who are dealing with psychiatric emergencies or psychiatric escalating symptoms, that our loved ones are in essence bleeding out, but it's not blood they're bleeding out. They're bleeding out far as psychiatrically, medically, and mentally, and we have to do something about it. So again, our prayers go out to the family members. Our prayers go out to all involved, because it's definitely hard. People beat themselves up about what we should have done, what could have happened, and unfortunately, many times we never know. No one has a crystal ball. You do the best you can, and you hope for the best. I'm just saying that as you're doing the best you can, that you incorporate some things in that. Okay? Incorporate having a discussion when your loved one is not in an acute phase. When you're not in an acute phase, talk about who to call in the crisis. Talk about what to do. What are the symptoms? What are baseline symptoms? What are escalating symptoms? Be engaged with support systems in your particular area. So again, It's Getting Better All the Time mental health outreach, providing information and support while encouraging hope and faith. Understanding that, number one, hope is available, treatment is available, that living with a severe and persistent mental illness doesn't mean that your life is over. It just means that you have an illness, a chronic illness that needs to be managed just like any other illness. And just like any other chronic illness, if the symptoms escalate, what do? You go see a doctor. If you have diabetes or hypertension and your symptoms begin to get worse, you call someone. You go to the emergency room. You see your doctor. It's the same thing when we talk about psychiatric or mental health issues. Again, It's Getting Better All the Time mental health outreach, providing information and support while encouraging hope and faith. You can log on to our website at igbattmho.org, or you can also email us at support@igbattmho.org. Have a great day.